Welcome back to the Climate Layer. I'm Alex Banat. I have been putting off this episode for a while, and I want to be honest about why. Getting political is, in many circles, considered digital suicide if you are not a political commentator or a politically focused podcast. You risk alienating half your audience before you've even made your point. You risk being dismissed as partisan before you've said anything partisan. You risk the conversation becoming about left versus right rather than about the thing you actually care about. So I've been careful. I've tried to stay in a specific lane: science, data, solutions. The economics of the energy transition, the misinformation designed to slow it down, the lies being circulated to slow down that progress. But here's the thing. I can't keep doing this show honestly without talking about what is happening right now. What is happening right now is that the United States federal government is waging an unprecedented war on science, on intellectualism, on the technologies that represent the future of our energy system, on the researchers, developers, and builders who are working to make that future real. That's not a political opinion. That's a description of policy. So today I'm going to do something I've resisted doing. I'm going to talk about politics. Not to tell you how to vote. Not to bash one party or celebrate another. I'm a registered independent. I follow the science, the research, and the logic. Specifically, the science and logic that maintains empathy for those who are struggling, empathy for endangered species, and empathy for the future generations who are right now being set up for failure. What I'm here to do is tell the true story, where we came from, what decisions were made, and the impact and consequences of those decisions have been, and why none of it, should be a partisan issue. Because wildfires don't check your voter registration. Hurricanes don't care about your politics. Droughts don't discriminate based on who you voted for. If the Earth were a human body right now, it will be running a fever, getting chills in certain places, warmer overall, and if we're not careful, it could burn us out. Climate change should never have been turned into a partisan issue. It has always been driven by science, and 195 separate countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. But it was made into one. And today, we're going to talk about how and what that cost us. So let's start at the beginning. So to understand where we are, we actually have to go back to 1979. The United States was in the middle of an energy crisis. Oil prices had spiked, gasoline lines stretched around the block. American dependence on foreign oil was not an abstraction. It was a daily reality that people felt in their wallets and in their daily lives. President Jimmy Carter understood something that many leaders at the time did not. That energy independence was not just an economic issue. It was a national security issue. And that the path to energy independence ran through the sun. On June 20th, 1979, Carter had 32 solar panels installed on the roof of the White House West Wing. They were solar thermal panels used to heat water for the White House cafeteria and laundry. Simple technology, practical application, and an enormously powerful symbol. Standing at the installation ceremony, Carter said something worth sitting with. He said that in the year 2000, those solar panels would either be a curiosity, a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or just a small part of one of the greatest and most exciting adventures ever undertaken by the American people. Harnessing the power of the sun to enrich our lives as we move away from our crippling dependence on foreign oil. Carter's administration also set an ambitious goal: 20% of U.S. energy from renewable sources by the year 2000. He backed it with tax credits for solar installations, research funding, and a genuine political commitment to building a clean energy future. In 1986, during what was described as routine roof repairs, the panels were quietly removed and put in a warehouse in Franconia, Virginia, and forgotten. At the same time, Carter's tax credits for renewable energy were allowed to expire. The research funding dried up, the political commitment seemed to evaporate. One panel eventually ended up at the Smithsonian. Another was acquired by Unity College in Maine, where it continued heating water until 2005. But the larger story, the one that matters, is what was lost. Carter saw the road. He pointed toward it. He put solar panels on the most powerful building in the world as a statement of where we were going, and we turned it around. And while that debate was happening in the United States, other countries kept building. Denmark committed to wind in the 1970s, and by the late 1980s, its turbine manufacturers were supplying wind projects around the world. Norway did something even more striking. It took its oil revenues, built a sovereign wealth fund now worth nearly $2 trillion, and invested it in a future rather than the past. That fund is now the single largest institutional investor in the global clean energy transition on Earth. Norway still pumps oil, and it achieved nearly 96% of new car sales as electric in 2025. That is not a contradiction, that's a strategy. The foundation of the global clean energy transition was being laid while the United States was arguing about whether to take it seriously. That is where the road diverged, and we have been paying for it ever since. Here's something worth knowing. In the decades between Carter and today, renewable energy was not always a partisan issue. George H.W. Bush signed the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which created tax incentives for wind energy and laid some groundwork for renewable development. Bill Clinton expanded those incentives. George W. Bush, despite his deep ties to the oil industry, signed legislation extending renewable energy tax credits and spoke about reducing dependence on foreign oil through domestic alternatives, including wind and solar. And here's something that might surprise you. Even in Donald Trump's first term, from 2017 to 2021, solar energy continued to grow. Not because of Trump's politics, but largely despite them. The economics worked, costs kept falling, deployment kept rising. His 2018 tariffs on Chinese solar modules were complicated for the industry in some ways, but they also helped restart domestic solar manufacturing that had nearly collapsed. Trump was always hostile to wind. That goes back decades, to a personal fight he waged against an offshore wind farm near his golf course in Scotland. He went to court over it, he lost, and he never forgave the industry. By 2019, he was telling audiences that wind turbines' noise causes cancer. That is not a policy position, that's a grudge. But solar? In his first term, Trump was largely indifferent to solar rather than actively hostile. He even floated the idea of a solar wall on the Mexican border, briefly causing solar stocks to spike. He was not a champion of clean energy, but he was not waging a war on solar either. Something changed, and to understand what changed, we have to talk about the Biden administration. I want to be careful here, because what I'm about to say is a criticism of a strategic decision, not of values or intent. President Biden understood the climate crisis. His administration put together the most significant climate legislation in American history. The Inflation Reduction Act invested hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy, including tax credits for electric vehicles, incentives for solar and wind deployment, and manufacturing support for domestic clean energy industries. The science was right. The intent was right. The scale of investment was right. And planting the presidential flag on electric vehicles and renewables as a signature identity of the Democratic Party was, I believe, a strategic mistake that we are still paying for. Here is why. Before the Biden administration made EVs a central campaign platform, electric vehicles were broadly popular across the political spectrum. Republican governors in states like Texas and Georgia were welcoming EV manufacturing plants. Republican lawmakers were supporting EV charging infrastructure in their districts because it meant jobs and investment. The technology was growing because the economics worked, not because it carried a political identity. The moment EVs became Biden's thing, they became a target for anyone who opposed Biden. That's not how energy technology should work. A battery doesn't have a political party. A solar panel doesn't vote. But once a technology gets absorbed into a partisan identity, it stops being evaluated on its merits and starts being evaluated on whether you are on the right team. The fossil fuel industry understood this immediately. If clean energy is the issue of one party, then opposing clean energy becomes the issue of the other party. And suddenly, you have the infrastructure for a culture war around technology that should have been evaluated purely on economics and national security grounds. I'm not saying Biden created climate denial. The fossil fuel industry has been manufacturing and seeding doubt since the 1980s. I am saying that a strategic communication decision made it dramatically easier for that industry to recruit allies and dramatically harder for clean energy advocates to build the bipartisan coalitions that durable energy policies require. Hindsight is 2020. Biden's team was dealing with a genuine crisis that required bold action. The IRA passed, the investments were real, the clean energy economy grew, and those are significant accomplishments. But the political cost of branding those accomplishments in a way that made them tribal rather than universal is something we are living with right now. Let me talk about where things stand as of right now, August 2026. The Trump administration has spent the last year and a half waging what can only be described as an unprecedented war on clean energy. Not just skepticism, not just indifference. Active, aggressive, federally funded opposition to the technologies that represent the future of the American energy system. Let's start with offshore wind. When federal courts struck down Trump's executive orders halting offshore wind construction, the administration went 0 for 5 in federal court. 5 cases, 5 losses. So they changed tactics. Since March of 2026, the administration has paid out more than $3 billion in taxpayer money to buy out offshore wind leases. More than $3 billion of your money spent to cancel energy projects when the demand and cost for electricity is exponentially increasing. As an example, RWE has now relinquished all of its U.S. offshore wind leases, where they had invested $1.3 billion towards building clean, renewable energy to help meet our growing demand for power. And that capacity has been taken off the market with taxpayer dollars. 3 of California's 5 offshore wind leases have been bought out, representing 5.6 gigawatts of potential capacity that would have powered over 2 million homes. 7 states are suing. California has filed multiple notices of intent to sue. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has called these buyouts what they are, a system designed to pull billions of dollars out of consumers' pockets and redirect them towards fossil fuel projects. And now solar is in the crosshairs. The president has posted on social media that his administration will not approve wind or, and I'm quoting directly here, farmer-destroying solar. He has called both wind and solar stupid, ugly, and a blight on the country. He called them the scam of the century. This from an administration that has made artificial intelligence dominance a priority platform. AI requires substantial investment in electric power and enormous amounts of flexible, on-demand capacity. Goldman Sachs projects that U.S. data center power demand will more than double by 2027, driven by AI infrastructure. Data centers now account for about half of all incremental electricity demand growth in the United States. We have not seen an energy demand spike like this since the post-World War II industrial expansion era. And the administration's answer to that spike is to limit our options to fossil fuels, the energy of the past for the demand of the future. This makes no sense, either from an economic or from an energy security standpoint. And it is making electricity for everyone more expensive. Jobs are being lost in red states, blue states, and purple states every time a project gets shut down or even delayed. We are falling behind China, Europe, and much of the rest of the world in the industries that will define the next century of economic power. And we're doing it deliberately. This is not sustainable. And I do not mean that in an environmental sense. I mean that as a country, as a nation, in the purely economic and energy security sense. We are tying the hands of the people who send us power. We are attacking the innovators building the technologies our children will inherit. We're making everything more expensive to achieve it. And this is what we call energy dominance? Here is what I want you to take from this episode. When I look at a solar panel on a roof, I don't see a Democratic roof or a Republican roof. I see a family that decided to take control of their energy costs. When I see a wind turbine on a Texas plain, I don't see a liberal versus conservative energy source. I see a rancher making money leasing their land while the wind generates power. When I see an EV charging in a driveway, I don't see a political statement. I see someone who decided that spending less money on fuel and maintenance was in their best interest. These technologies should not have parties, but rather scientifically empowered economics. And the economics are compelling regardless of which box you check on a ballot. I understand what some people think when they look at a wind turbine. They may think it's ugly. They think it ruins the landscape. And I recognize that reaction on a visceral level, even if I don't agree with it. You know what I think is ugly? Smog hanging over a city. A coal plant's smokestack against a blue sky. An oil spill spreading across a pristine ocean. A family having to decide whether to pay their energy bill or buying groceries. A community breathing polluted air because of what is being burned down the street. That is ugly. That is the cost of the status quo. And it's a cost that falls hardest on the people who have the fewest options. The communities living near refineries and power plants. The families who cannot afford to move away from the pollution. The workers in industries that are being kept alive by political will rather than economic reality. Buying time rather than building a future. I am not naive enough to say we can power this country on solar and wind with battery storage alone, at least right now. The transition is real and it takes time. Nuclear has a role. Natural gas has a role in the transition. And everything and the kitchen sink approach is the honest answer to the scale of this challenge. But the research I have done shows me the clear path that is needed. And what we need is an energy policy that reflects reality rather than ideology, that puts consumers, workers, and national security ahead of the interests of the industries that are fighting to stay relevant past their time. That treats climate change as the economic and national security challenge it actually is, rather than a culture war that someone decided was useful. Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House in 1979 and pointed towards a future that was entirely possible. We took them down. We put them in a warehouse. And while we were arguing about whether that road was worth taking, other countries drove down it and built industries that now dominate global markets. We have done this over and over again. We pioneered the solar cell. China manufactures over 80% of the world's solar panels now. We invented the lithium-ion battery. China dominates battery production in the world now. We built the first large-scale wind farms. Denmark and Germany turned wind into export industries. We keep inventing the future and then stepping aside while others build it. And now we have an administration spending billions of taxpayer dollars to actively cancel the clean energy projects that states, utilities, and private investors have already committed to. Not because the economics don't work. The economics work. Not because the technology doesn't work. The technology works. But because someone decided that these technologies belong to the other team. And that is the reason enough to destroy them. That's neither energy strategy or a sound policy. That's a culture war with energy as the centerpiece and the consumer, its casualty. Climate change is not a partisan issue. It never was. Wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, rising seas. They don't care about our politics. The atmosphere does not negotiate. The physics are not subject to executive orders. As I said before, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I am here to tell you the truth about what's happening and why it matters. And the truth is that we are making decisions right now in real time that will shape the energy system, the economy, and the climate that our children and grandchildren inherit. The future generation deserves better than this. If you found the content in this episode to be meaningful, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you have thoughts, pushbacks, or questions, reach out to us at theclimatelayer@gmail.com. As always, stay curious, ask questions, and keep peeling back the layers. I'm Alex Banat, and this is The Climate Layer.